A warm welcome from Freiburg. My name is Bernd Kortmann. I'm the director of this institute, which covers all disciplines, so not just humanities, social sciences, but also natural sciences, medicine, engineering. And we have about 50 fellows with us between 2 to 12 months here per year. Even at the time of the pandemic, we have 20 fellows with us at the moment. It's a great honor for FRIAS to be part of this research consortium, and an even greater honor to serve as the hub for this consortium, which is something that we still need to prove. We wanted to host the original conference in May, then we wanted to host this one. Now we are just looking forward and hoping for June next year. But also apart from this and next year's conference, there are human rights activities at FRIAS. We currently do have 2 senior fellows working in this field. Silja Fönicki is one of them, working on responsible artificial intelligence. And soon, in fact, FRIAS will additionally welcome as a distinguished fellow an expert on human rights studies, who will be with us for a 3-year period. And it is our expectation that this scholar will contribute to fueling the rich discussions between human rights scholars in Baden-Württemberg and Connecticut, and will also enter into fruitful discussions with all of these scholars. So much about FRIAS in general terms. Let me add one thing, though, in the context of the topic of this session: human rights in times of the pandemic. And this is why it may be worthwhile for all participants to have at least a quick look at your chat right now. So similar to our colleagues at the Human Rights Institute at UConn, specifically our first speaker, Shareen Hertel, it was in early May that my co-director at FRIAS, an economist, and I thought of putting together a volume on the world after the pandemic, authored by about 30 distinguished scholars from a broad range of disciplines. Against our expectations, but solely because of the enormous motivation, discipline, and cooperation of our authors, we succeeded in completing this project extremely swiftly and seeing the book published in late September. Its title is, I simply translated from German, Beyond Corona, the World After, or Our World After the Pandemic, Perspectives from Science. Questions addressed in this volume include the following: what will remain of the crisis and its profound changes and challenges? Is the crisis a turning point in history or merely a dent in long-term trends? How will Corona change our lives in family, workplace, education, business, politics, culture, and science? About 2/3 of these contributions are from the humanities and social sciences, about 1/3 from the behavioral sciences, natural sciences, and medicine. More information you find in the link in the chat. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our main speaker of this session, Professor Shareen Hertel. Shareen is a professor of political science and human rights and a joint faculty member of the Department of Political Science and the Human Rights Institute at UConn, where she co-directs the Economic and Social Rights Program. She has served as consultant to foundations, NGOs, and United Nations agencies in the US, Latin America, and South Asia. Her research focuses on changes in transnational human rights advocacy with a focus on labor and economic rights issues. Her most recent book publication has the title Tethered Fates: Companies, Communities, and Rights at Stake, published by Oxford University Press last year. Most important for her talk today is one of her editorial tasks she is diligently fulfilling as a wonderful service to the entire scholarly community. Since 2013, she has served as editor of the Journal of Human Rights, the journal itself being based at UConn for close to 2 decades, and, as she writes, welcoming submissions from all over the world. This is an invitation. Shareen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. It's a joy to be here. And after such august company and entry remarks, I am very humbled to have an opportunity to speak with you briefly, and excited also to share this time with my colleague, Sarah Willen, who will speak about another UConn initiative. My goal here is to simply give you a quick overview, and I'm very grateful because Eva is going to help manage the slides as I do, of this special issue of the Human Rights Journal that I edit, the Journal of Human Rights, which we composed very quickly in response to the pandemic. Last year, in the spring, I thought I would be on sabbatical. I was at the University of Michigan briefly, University of Pittsburgh, and suddenly the world changed dramatically. And instead of coming to see all of you in Freiburg, I was grounded and went home, and just like everyone else, spent a sabbatical rethinking. And in many ways, I wanted to invite Sylvia to show you very quickly, Eva rather, the first realization was how quickly the pandemic was moving. So the first bullet in this slide shows us a link to the very wonderful Johns Hopkins interactive map, which another university has created and is really the definitive, in the light of the current administration's inability to do so on a national level, the definitive mapping of global trends in COVID prevalence and spread. That map is changing momentarily, every moment in real time. If we toggle back to my slides, given the rapidity and the speed with which the COVID pandemic was moving, I had to think about how to harness this vehicle known as the journal, in the Journal of Human Rights, as a vehicle for addressing these issues, knowing how slow academic publishing is typically. And so if we toggle to the next slide, my challenge as an editor was to create a forum for analyzing the human rights implications of the pandemic. We are blessed at the Journal of Human Rights, the next bullet will show you, to have an extraordinary editorial board with scholars in multiple disciplines, many of them on this call right now, stretching across the world from Bangladesh to Boston, doing amazing work as scholars and policy advocates. And so we put out a call very quickly to our editorial board. The next click, we can show you who they are. We very quickly summoned the board and said, please help us make this issue happen and let us do it in an extraordinarily quick way. We negotiated with the team at Taylor and Francis to be able to make this journal free access. And we persuaded them that, unlike traditional hard scientific publications, which they were already making accessible to the scholarly community free of charge, we felt that this issue of the human rights implications of the journal should also be made available as free access. And so with the help of our remarkable board, several of whom are contributors to this volume, we were able to quickly assemble a call for papers and a very wonderful overview. And so if we return to the slides a moment, I'll give you a very quick next slide with an outline of the time frame. So the first bullet gives you, as I said, the landscape, the lockdown and outreach to the board took place in March. Next, we put out a call to the response of those authors who came forward. April and May, we worked with them. By June through August, we had fast track of submissions and review. And by, in the next bullet, by the early fall, we were already moving into proofs and production. Kathy Liebel, who I know is on the call, is an incredibly great example of the authors who were shouldering not only their scholarly and teaching work amidst the pandemic, but then put their shoulders to the wheel and began reflecting in their own areas of expertise in this incredibly compressed time frame to pull an article, in her case co-authored with our colleague Prakash Kashwan, together for this volume. And now we are in the final bullet on this slide at the point of being slated for release. This issue will release within the next 3 days. It should be out by the 12th of November. It will be released simultaneously as a whole cloth online, and it will be free access for a period of time. And so we are urging all of you, there is a link to a flyer for the contributions of the journal in the program, but we would urge all of you to help us spread the word about this vehicle. So if we head to the next slide very quickly, I'd like to just give you a sense of the range of contributors. In the first bullet, you'll see the level of interdisciplinarity of our contributors. So our first click, if you could just click the next click in the slide, was to find multiple contributors across fields: anthropology, bioethics, business, law, medicine, pharmacy, political science, and social work are all of the disciplines represented amongst our contributors. And in the next bullet, you'll also see multiple regions of the world. We have contributors from the US and Canada, Croatia, Sweden, and a number of those contributors conducting active research that they draw upon in these articles in South Asia, in Africa, Latin America, and in Europe. In addition, we're very fortunate in the next bullet to have colleagues who are doing incredible work both quantitatively and qualitatively, and in an interpretivist vein. This is one of the most interdisciplinary and methodologically heterodox volumes we've ever produced. And if you click to the final click, we can take a look here at the actual PDF that we've made available for all of you. This is the overview. And what I'm going to do in the next 2 or 3 slides, and then I want to invite my wonderful colleague Sarah as I finish up to talk about another sister project of this. But if you look very quickly, we can toggle from this slide back to the main slides. I'm going to go through the 3 segments very quickly and give you a sense of the themes that this issue touches on. 3 sections, all of which touch on the wonderful interdisciplinary contributions, but demonstrate the interdependent nature of rights at risk in the context of COVID-19. The first section, if we click here, looks at centering theory and practice around human rights. And the first contributions are by several of the most eminent human rights theorists. So if you click to the next, we look at revisiting interdependence in times of crisis by Michael Goodhart, our wonderful colleague in the philosophy of human rights at University of Pittsburgh. And then a forecasted failure of intersectionality, Kim Thaden's very hard-hitting piece as an anthropologist looking at discourses of masculinity and misogyny in the context of the COVID crisis, and then solidarity in times of crisis, a wonderful piece by, as I mentioned, Kathy and our colleague Prakash Kashwan, drawing on solidarist theory, the theory of solidarity, which is very underplayed in human rights theory, and looking across the US and India in comparative contexts. The next section looks again at interdependence, but this does so from within the field of health. And this is why I was so thrilled to have Sarah presenting in a few moments on her work, because this section, if we look at the first bullet, takes a view of global health and human rights by several of the most eminent scholars of public health in Canada, Lisa Foreman and Gillian Clare Kohler, in the schools of pharmacy and in public health. The next piece looks at obligations of drug companies, and this is by 2 scholars at University of Santa Clara, Michael Santoro, a board member of ours, who are looking as scholars of business and human rights at the human rights obligations of drug companies. And finally, the third, Eileen Wong, as a doctor herself, and her sister Wendy Wong, a wonderful board member of our journal at the University of Toronto. The sisters Wong together look at COVID's implications for our larger discussion of systemic protection of the right to health and health systems, and in particular an engagement with the role of the WHO, which in our own context is quite beleaguered in the United States, but a much more broad-based, fortunately 2 Canadian scholars writing on this at the moment. Wonderful look at health and human rights in the context of COVID and the specific nature of the WHO mandate. Then the final section is, for me as a political scientist, a particular joy to have included, because this looks carefully at questions of power and control. And if we take a look at the first bullet here, Legal Empowerment by Sukti Dittal and Tyler Walton is a wonderful piece looking at justice reforms that are going to naturally have to result from the COVID epidemics, laying bare the crisis of immigrants at risk and people in mixed status at risk in this context. And these are 2 scholars at the New York University Law Clinic, so extremely action-oriented legal research. The second piece in this section is Jayaramji Nogales and Iris Goldner-Lang being a scholar, a European-based scholar in Croatia, looking at migration pressures both in Europe and in the United States. I'm really interested in people's perspectives as European scholars looking at the challenge of migration. And finally, the final piece here is a real tour de force. Their state surveillance by Christine Eck and Sophia Hatz, who are both scholars of political violence in Sweden, very connected to the Uppsala project there. State surveillance, so again, several people have invoked that, and I think connects beautifully to the work that colleagues in this consortium are doing around surveillance technologies and science and human rights. And the final, a very important piece by Didier Fassin, which is, I'm sorry, I've left off. The final piece in this issue, if we go back, is a piece on detention and the fate of migrants. So unfortunately, I've left that off this slide, but it is included in the final overview of all of the pieces. And so finally, on this slide, future work, we really did not cover enough in this issue. And so it begs the question, and we hope to have individual submissions over the coming year, looking at some of the challenges related to economic rights in the context of the COVID pandemic. Economic restructuring in the United States, there's been tremendous difficulty in reforming social welfare system and social welfare delivery, regulation in the context of workplace regulation, protective equipment, pay and tying of benefits to workplace employment is one of the themes that we're excited to cover and we hope will continue. And finally, the final point here, systemic racism, the twin pandemic, obviously, for the United States. This has been laid bare, but as folks mentioned earlier in opening remarks, there are a reckoning around gender and other forms of identity politics in the context of the COVID epidemic. So we look forward to continuing this dialogue across multiple issues. And finally, in these final 2 slides, I want to show you just a very quick glimpse. This is, as I said, going to be a free issue, time-bound. Content will be free as part of the larger coronavirus publishing of Taylor and Francis. And then my final slide is the nice segue to Sarah's own work. We really struggled in this issue in bringing it out very quickly to get a fair and even balanced reflection of voices from the global South. Prakash Kashwan raised this point and consequently agreed to co-author with Kathy, but we are keenly aware of the need, and I'm grateful for Frias's role in really sponsoring broad-based dialogue across multiple regions of the world. But if you look at the percentage of articles that are generally running in JHR, we have a very small percentage from Africa and from parts of Latin America and the Middle East, and a very disproportionate share of our submissions still coming from the US, Canada, and Europe. The contributions just by region alone show that, but then by countries, if you look in the 2019, 17 to 19 smaller inset box, a few colleagues from Germany, but the disproportionate share, we have several hundred submissions annually coming from the US still. So this is an invitation really to all of you as my wonderful colleagues in this consortium to think about publishing in JHR, to encourage your colleagues with whom many of you carry out research in the Global South to do so, and to continue to help us promote this particular issue. I would be remiss if I wasn't able to thank extraordinarily Yu Hong, who is on this call, for the ongoing support of Global Affairs for our work. The support for the journal, which we receive from the publisher, is matched, and then again some, by the University of Connecticut's longstanding support for the journal. And to say how excited and grateful I am to have colleagues who are routinely reviewing for us who are part of this call today. So with that, and with this call for plurality of voices, I want to introduce my colleague Sarah Willen, who, and I'm sure Bernd will introduce her a bit more, who will talk about a companion initiative focusing on human rights and COVID.
Yeah, thanks, Shareen. And yeah, let me just introduce Sarah very briefly. She's an associate professor of anthropology at UConn and director of the research program on global health and human rights at the Human Rights Institute. Her first book came out in 2019 and has received several awards already: Fighting for Dignity, Migrant Lives at Israel Margins. Sarah will present to you in all but 5 minutes a COVID-related project she has recently co-founded. Sarah.
Thank you so much for this wonderful introduction. Thank you, Shareen, for sharing your time, and congratulations to all. It's really a tremendous honor and privilege to be together today. I'll speak very briefly about an initiative that's very much in the early stages. We've just heard from Shareen about the extraordinary research product that came together in just a short number of months. I'll speak about an initiative that's just at its beginning, called the Pandemic Journaling Project, which in effect is a weekly journaling project. Journaling, I know, doesn't quite translate into German the way we hear it in English. It's really like a Tagebuch, but on a weekly basis. So we're inviting people to record very briefly their experience of these quite extraordinary times in a few minutes a week. And at the same time, everything contributed to a journal becomes part of a research archive, a durable archive that will be available to researchers now and into the future. The core partners in this project are the University of Connecticut and a colleague of mine at Brown University. We both are medical anthropologists, and that frames the project in ways that will become clear in just a moment. If we could have the next slide, please. So essentially the way this works, and I've put some links into the chat so that you can check it out on your own. Essentially, we invite people to join, and upon joining, they complete a baseline survey, so we get some general information about our participants. And then in the first week and subsequent weeks, we present some narrative prompts to get people thinking. The first is consistent from week to week. We ask, how is the coronavirus pandemic affecting your life right now? And we invite people to respond either in writing if they wish, by uploading an audio recording of their voice, or by uploading a photograph and writing or talking about it. And if we could click to the next slide, please. The entire platform is up and running both in English and in Spanish. So one needs to have one of those languages in order to engage with the project, but certainly one can contribute in any language. And if one were interested in setting it up entirely in German as well, we could certainly do that. Next slide, please. So we launched at the very end of May. So far, we've got more than 550 people contributing from 24 countries around the world. So far, participants have contributed more than 4,700 entries, individual entries, and that number grows from one week to the next. We've got some information on the bottom left showing that among our US participants, oh, if we could click back, please. Thank you. About half identify as white, but we do see a good amount of diversity in our sample so far in terms of Hispanic and Latino participants, people who identify as Black or Asian or Pacific Islander. So we're seeing some diversity. We want to continue growing and hear as many different kinds of voices as possible. If we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. So you can see we've got representation from voices in many parts of the world, predominantly the United States, for reasons similar to those I think Shareen was sharing, but also a good amount of participation in Mexico and other parts of Latin America. As you can see, we don't yet have anyone contributing from Germany. We have contributors from France, from Greece, from the UK, from India, South Africa, and we're very much thinking about how to make this platform available for individuals to create a record of their own experiences around the world. One thing I should add, individuals can download their journal at any point securely. So it's set up in such a way that people are creating something that will have value for themselves, for their families into the future, just a weekly record of what it's like to live in these extraordinary times, and all of that material becomes part of a research archive. So if we could go to the next slide, please. Thank you. The project is, it's designed both to have social media appeal, so it's on Facebook and Instagram and Twitter, and at the same time, it's really designed as a full-fledged research study. The one thing I'll add before I close is that this is, as I mentioned, this is a project very much at its beginning, and I would really, again, an invitation early this morning or afternoon, I would really invite anyone who sees value in recording the voices of individuals now. If one sees that as something that could contribute to your research, we would invite you to reach out, to communicate with us about questions you'd like us to pose. We'd be happy to encourage participants in German, or to in fact set up the entire thing for to create a German corpus, a parallel German corpus if there were interest. We do, because of the way we've designed the baseline survey, we have a good amount of demographic information about our participants, and we also have mental health information. So we ask bi-weekly mental health questions. We ask questions periodically about COVID exposure. So we're generating what's very much a mixed methods archive that we hope will allow researchers now and into the future to have a window onto what life was like in this time. So thank you very much for making space to learn a bit about the project. Again, you can see some links in the chat if you'd like to learn more. And I look forward to learning and thinking with all of you for the rest of this wonderful day.